Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. A warm welcome to all participants joining us today from across the region and beyond. Thank you for taking the time to be part of the launch of our new webinar series on the nutrition and gender nexus in food system transformation. The first session is titled Status of Women in Agri-Food Systems, Unlocking Opportunities for Food and Nutrition Security in Asia and the Pacific. The series is co-organized by ADB's Gender Equality Division and Agriculture, Food and Nature and Rural Development, AFNR. The series is part of our efforts to operationalize the AFNR's approach paper on food system transformation, which recognize nutrition as a critical lever to achieve prosperity, sustainability, and resilience. The gender equality and social inclusion agenda is at the heart of this agenda. And today's discussion anchors us firmly at the intersection of gender empowerment and nutrition outcomes. My name is Toko Kato. I work in the agriculture sector of ADB as Senior Food and Nutrition Specialist. And I would like to sincerely thank our collaborators from the Climate Change and Sustainable Development Department, especially Gender Equality Team, head by Director Sam Hang, my counterpart Bimbika and Andrew and Mikey, and my counterpart Communication Officer Sol. And thanks to my teammates, my gratitude also goes to our esteemed speakers and colleagues who have joined us today. For this session, we are privileged to have these insights from FAO's 2023 report on the status of women in agri-food systems. This is a major global analysis of its kind in more than a decade, and provides timely evidence on why advancing gender equality is key to achieving nutrition security and sustainable food systems, especially for Asia and the Pacific. To formally open this session, it is my great pleasure to invite Director Yasmin Siddiqui, who leads the Agriculture, Food, Nature, and Rural Development Sector Office, to deliver her opening remarks. Director Yasmin, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Tomoko. And just as Tomoko mentioned, a good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending where you're joining from. And it's a great pleasure to be here to provide some opening remarks. Well, firstly, on behalf of ADB's Agriculture, Food, Nature, and Rural Development Sector and the Gender Equality Division, it's really a privilege to welcome all of you to this important first in our series on nutrition and gender webinar. It's really a great opportunity for us to listen and learn from each other on this important topic as we advance on the gender equality agenda, and specifically coming from the sector that I'm covering together with Tomoko and other colleagues, where we're often at the heart of the rural economy, not just as the producers of the food that many of you would see on your tables in the evening when you have your dinner, but also a sector where the challenges faced by women can often be some of the harshest, and where social inclusion, gender inclusion is really critical. And we also see in the rural environment the impacts of climate and disaster risk really impacting tremendously on agricultural productivity and water and food security. So the session is extremely timely, following the release of FAO's flagship report on the status of women in agri-food systems. And this provides the updated insights and data on persistent gender inequalities in the sector, and that's the 2025 updates. So I think even having had a look at the report, we can really see some of those key areas that are being emphasized. And Lauren, we look forward to listening to you to really guide us and steer us. The topic is personally of tremendous value. Often I find myself reminding everyone that at the end of the day, we must think about who are we trying to reach through ADB's development objectives, and that 50% of that population is women, and that women are often at the front end of producing, growing food and doing some of those really arduous tasks. So without further ado, Lauren, it's an honor to have you with us today. You're the lead author of the report, and absolute kudos to you and your team for updating it, and also having that foresight to produce such a document, which can be a guiding instrument and publication for all of us. For us at ADB, we really want to strive to deliver on our commitments to food security, nutrition, and gender equality. I'm going to add water security in there as well, because women are the managers of water, which is the critical input to growing food. I'd like to thank our gender team, Sam and Bimbika and other colleagues who've joined, and to the communications team. It's a great opportunity for all of us to listen and really learn from the session today. So thank you all. I'll stop there. Over to you, Lauren.
Thank you so much, colleagues. It's a great honor to be here with you for this first session, and I really appreciate the ADB and the teams involved on hosting such a seminar. As the colleagues mentioned, I'm going to present some findings from the 2023 Status of Women in Agri-Food Systems report. I'm just going to share my screen. Now, the report is not fully focused, and neither is my presentation, on nutrition for women, but I'm going to give you some insights into food security for women. And I'll try to make the case that understanding the context of gender equality in agri-food systems and women's empowerment has a lot to do with ensuring that women have access to adequate and sufficient food, as well as nutritious food. So the report was published in April of 2023. We have been producing regional specific versions of the report. Our Africa version will be launched this year. We launched the Latin American version earlier this year, and we would love to discuss more with ADB how to make sure that we have an Asia-Pacific focused version of this report. I will try to highlight wherever possible data and evidence from Asia, however, in my presentation. So just to start, the report is a very comprehensive and global overview of women in agri-food systems, and it highlights how structural inequalities are linked to gender, as well as intersecting social and economic differentiation in the report. When we're talking about agri-food systems, we're talking about men and women's roles from production on the farm, through processing, marketing, transportation, and sales of food into consumption of food. So the report tries to look at women's roles and gender inequalities throughout the whole system. It also reflects an evolution from a focus on just gaps between men and women to promoting gender transformative change which can help us to overcome entrenched inequalities between men and women. And the report also places gender equality and women's empowerment as an objective in and of itself, as a good which we should be promoting, as well as a means to improve agri-food systems. I'm going to skip that slide. Sorry, I made some corrections that didn't come through in the end. So let me start with what we know about food insecurity and nutrition for women globally and also in Asia. There is a persistent gap between women and men's food insecurity, and women are generally, especially in rural areas, more likely to be food insecure than men. In Asia, these gaps are notable. We see here in Southern Asia that the gap between men and women is 42% of food insecurity for women and 38.8% for men. But you can see across the graphs here, which have the world, Asia, and different parts of Asia, that there is a notable gap in all regions. Those gaps peaked during COVID-19, when the gap between men and women's food insecurity rose to 8.7%. Thankfully, it has now come down. It's closer to parity. But this was driven, in fact, by gender differences. We looked for all sorts of other reasons which could have driven this gap and found that discrimination and cultural practices were the main driver of this gap. As I mentioned, food insecurity increased amongst rural women in particular during COVID-19. And we noticed when we did some decomposition of different food insecurity by regions and by types of people that women in rural areas are significantly more food insecure and have been disproportionately affected by the pandemic and since then. The report also makes an estimation that if we could close the gaps that we identified in employment, income, and education, we could reduce this food insecurity gap by more than half, by 57%. And discrimination is a strong driver of the gap, as I mentioned. Now, I'm going to then present some of the key findings of the report. So we start the report by looking at the role of agri-food systems in women's employment and men's employment, and find that globally 40% of women who work in agri-food systems, along with 42% of men. So many women are dependent on agri-food systems for their livelihoods. Those numbers are much higher in some regions than in others. In sub-Saharan Africa, more than 60% of women are dependent on agri-food systems, and in South Asia, the number is even higher, 72% or so. And this represents a decline since 2005, and the reason for that decline is that the number of people who are working on the farm in agriculture is declining everywhere globally, but the number of people that are working in off-farm agri-food systems is either stable or increasing, depending on the region. So you can see that I've circled the decline is being driven by agriculture. And we consistently emphasize that agri-food systems are a greater source of livelihoods for women than for men in Asia and elsewhere in the world. Here you can see the share of agri-food system employment in total employment by, apologies, I meant to, let me just go back, in Asian subregions. And you can see here that women is always the first column. So I don't know if you can see my cursor, but you can see that women are heavily dependent in various regions of the world, like in Southern Asia, but also in Central Asia. Women are more dependent on this kind of employment than men. As I mentioned, there has been a reduction in agricultural employment. And in India, in particular, Southern Asia is driven by the statistics in India, where many women are working in agriculture, and there is an out-migration of men from rural areas in that country and other countries in the sub-region. I'm going to skip this slide, I apologize. Now, despite the importance of agri-food systems employment for women in Asia and globally, women's roles in agri-food systems are not equal to men's. Their working conditions tend to be characterized by irregular work or informal work. Many women work in part-time roles despite their desire to work in more long-term or full-time jobs. They are also segmented to the low-skilled, labor-intensive parts of the value chain that produce less value. So they're not participating in the marketing aspects or the transport aspects, which tend to be the most well-paid and value-adding elements of the food system. And also their jobs are vulnerable, which is a classification that our colleagues at the International Labour Organization use to categorize jobs which have low levels of protection. I'll say more about that on the next slide. So in Asia, 94% of women and 89% of men who work in agriculture are in self-employment, which is considered a vulnerable type of work. That means that they're either working on their own farms or they're counted as contributing family workers. And here you can see in the highlighted box on the right that the number of men and women that are especially contributing family workers is not equal. So women are much more likely to be considered to be supporting their families through their farm work than men. So 51% of women in Asia, you can see that in the brown box here, are supporting their families and not considered to be the main worker in agriculture. In off-farm agri-food systems employment, so that's all of the other parts of the value chain, marketing, processing, transport, etc., 53% of women work for wages in Asia compared to 65% of men. Working for wages usually means you have regular and steady employment and that you are likely to have some kinds of protections as well as health and safety conditions, which are facilitating decent work in agri-food systems. There's also a significant gap between the levels of productivity that men and women are able to achieve on farms of the same size. Globally, FAO estimated that the gap is 24%. And the reason for this has to do with both the fact that women and men have unequal access to assets and resources that can allow for agricultural productivity, but also due to discrimination, the quality of the land that men and women might have, the extent to which they are able to access the resources that they need. Additionally, we found that there is a gap in the pay between men and women, and that women on average earn 82 cents for every dollar earned by men in wage employment in agriculture. There are also gaps elsewhere in the agri-food systems value chains, and that all of these gaps and discrimination are driven by unpaid and domestic and care work, which limit women's opportunities for paid employment or for productivity on farms. And generally across the world, women on average spend more than 4 hours a day on unpaid care and domestic work, while men spend less than 2 hours. In Asia, the difference ranges from an hour in Laos to 3 hours in Kazakhstan. There are much larger gaps in other parts of the world. As I mentioned in the previous slide, to explain some of these gaps, there are gaps in access to assets and resources between men and women. There are significant gaps to land access, inputs, services, finance, and digital technology. And I'll say a little bit more about that on the coming slides. So land is obviously a key asset for the production and use of agriculture, and men have greater ownership of land in 40 out of 46 countries where data from the SDGs is available. In Asia, that's the case for 7 out of 9 countries where data is available. This is from the SDG indicators that FAO is the custodian for. And you can see that in the graph on the left. By anywhere the dot is above the line is where men have greater access to land and ownership of land than women. And there's a couple of dots there in purple. You can see Cambodia with just more women owning land than men, and Myanmar with about equal access. There has been improvements in Asia in women's ownership of land. The share of women owning land has increased in India, Nepal, Cambodia, and has decreased in Pakistan. And there's a lot of links between land ownership and other positive benefits for women. So in addition to increasing productivity and investment, as well as incomes, there are relationships between land ownership and reduction in gender-based violence. Many of those studies come from India, as well as other forms of women's empowerment. In terms of the gap between men and women in access to mobile internet technology, which is of course very critical for receiving information about farming practices, but also for marketing, sales of food, 10% fewer women than men use the internet in Asia in 2022. And the gender gap has been narrowing globally from 25% to 16%. But there are persistent gaps, especially in countries in South Asia. So in Pakistan, for example, the gap is 35% between men and women's access to mobile use. In rural areas, the gap is even larger, ranging from 55% in Bangladesh to 15% in Indonesia. So generally, we think that women have less access to the internet and mobile technology than men, and women in rural areas are particularly disadvantaged in the use of these kinds of resources. As I mentioned, a lot of the findings of the report focus not only on the sort of material lack of access that women face in agri-food systems, but also on social norms which can be discriminatory and rules which affect gender inequality. In fact, they drive gender inequality. And the report places a heavy emphasis on increasing gender equality and empowerment, which is essential for women's well-being, but also because especially increasing women's empowerment has a number of co-benefits. A lot of these are actually related to nutrition. So there's a lot of studies which show globally, but using case studies from Bangladesh and other parts of Asia as well, that when women are empowered, children's nutrition improves, as does household dietary diversity and food security. Agricultural productivity of households also improves. There's less evidence about the impact for women's own nutrition. So studies which have tried to associate women's empowerment with changes to women's BMI have not found as significant results, but that's in part because changing outcomes for women's nutrition is a longer term endeavor. Additionally, we would like to just mention that while there are good approaches, which I'm going to outline on the coming slides, for improving empowerment and changing social norms, they are slow to change. But policies have started to reflect the reality for the gaps between women and men more quickly. 75% of policy documents in agriculture and agri-food systems that we analyzed at least recognize women's challenges, but many fewer, less than 20%, have goals related to gender. This is just to give you a sense of some of the indicators that our colleagues at the World Bank produce about women's participation in businesses and about norms, which comes from demographic data, showing that, for example, while the number of countries which have improving scores on women, business, and the law is increasing in East Asia and South Asia as well as the rest of the world, there isn't very much of an improvement on things like whether or not people believe that gender-based violence or intimate partner violence is acceptable. Finally, the report also looks at the differential impacts between men and women of shocks. I've already mentioned the food insecurity impact of COVID-19, but there were some very surprising findings about the impact of COVID-19 on women and men's employment. So in Asia, 29% of women lost their jobs in off-farm agri-food systems in the first year of COVID-19, compared with 2% of men. That meant that the jobs that were being shedded were likely jobs which were considered to be less important or where women were working in part-time roles. And so many more women than men lost their jobs. And additionally, we found in this report and a subsequent report called The Unjust Climate that women are disproportionately likely to suffer from climatic and heat and weather shocks. So they have less resilience to climate change. Women's work is more impacted and their income losses are greater than men's during droughts, floods, and periods of heat extremes. So I'll just conclude by talking about some policy findings of the report. The first is that approaches which try to look at discriminatory social norms, we call these gender transformative approaches, are cost effective and can have a positive impact on norms at the local level. We have evidence from Nepal and Bangladesh about the importance of GTAs, and we encouraged in the report for greater evidence to be generated on this topic, given the promising nature of these kinds of interventions. Additionally, as I mentioned, closing gaps in land tenure has a range of benefits on employment, investment, natural resource management, food security, and the reductions in gender-based violence. And something that agricultural ministries tend not to think very much about, but turns out to be very important in a comprehensive social setting, is that when women, both in agriculture and working off-farm, have access to formal childcare, the returns on their employment improve, as well as their sense of well-being. Some other policy highlights we wanted to highlight is that women generally are more likely to adapt technology and to have access to resources if they're working in groups. There are many practices from India and from other parts of the region like Vietnam, which have shown that if you have women working through existing groups or you create new groups, that they're more likely to have access to climate information and to adopt climate smart agricultural practices. And participatory committees have also improved access to water. Yasmin mentioned water security as being very important for women, health and nutrition. Many of these studies, again, coming from South Asia. Finally, social protection as a way of insulating women from shocks and stresses, but also supporting their livelihoods, has a very important impact on women's employment and their resilience. We have examples from Bangladesh about the ability of social protection to help households through women improve and cope with floods and erosion. The report closes with a series of calls to action. The first is that while we have better and more availability of high quality data about the differences between men and women in agri-food systems and nutrition, we still need to continue to invest in research and additional statistics and which provide information disaggregated by sex. We found, for example, that there's very little information which is sex disaggregated on things like livestock ownership or fisheries or forestry resources. Additionally, we call for all actors to try to intervene at scale. So, for example, with the Asian Development Bank and your incredible recent decisions to increase the amount of investment in agri-food systems, that helping to invest at scale could close these asset and resource gaps, which could increase global GDP by at least 1% and provide increased food security for 45 million people. And finally, we called on all actors to consider interventions which were intentionally focused on women's empowerment, because we found, as I mentioned, that empowerment has an array of benefits, and especially it could increase household level incomes for about 58 million people if all of us were working together to ensure that our existing projects and resources were focused on women's empowerment and increase the resilience to climatic and other shocks for 235 million people, which is obviously critical in a period of changing climate. So that's it for me. I'll stop there and I look forward to your questions and comments. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lauren, for this comprehensive and thought-provoking presentation with data. You clearly laid out the evidence on gender gaps in agri-food system, their linkages to nutrition outcomes and pathway for gender empowerment, that women's empowerment that can drive systematic change. So your insights on policy levers and data gaps are particularly relevant for us in ADB and in our community as we seek to design more gender-sensitive and nutrition-sensitive investment. So to deepen this conversation, I'm pleased to invite Director Yasmin to provide reflections and perspectives, particularly from ADB's operational lens and our evolving approach to mainstreaming gender and nutrition in food system transformation. Director Yasmin, over to you.
Thank you so much. Well, firstly, Lauren, congratulations on the report again, and thank you so much for really capturing those salient points. Your summary resonated so well. I found myself at many points saying, yes, this is exactly the type of information and the insight that we also need from a sectoral context and beyond the sector, of course, you mentioned social protection. But firstly, your presentation really powerfully highlights the persistent structural inequalities within the agri-food systems that impact on women's economic empowerment, productivity, and nutrition outcomes. And I would say beyond that as well, the role and voice of women, which often still remains hidden. And bridging these gaps is really critical, not only from the gender equality perspective, but also for achieving that broader food security and nutrition goals. The data you've showed on the time spent by women, 4.2 hours on unpaid care work versus the 1.9 hours of men's time, is really striking. And while you were speaking, I was taken back to what we often hear when we're in the field, listening to women, is how should they manage both that time that they need for engaging in income generation and childcare. And we see that in many countries, particularly when we hear about women and how far they have to travel to get back to their agricultural fields and come home, feed their children, go back again. So that's really an area that needs much more thought and consideration in the projects that organizations such as ADB develop. I think the next point is around ownership of assets, specifically land ownership, agricultural productivity, and nutrition. And it's well evidenced, yet women's land rights remain a big barrier in Asia. And we're seeing encouraging trends from our work in India, Nepal, and Cambodia, which are worth scaling up and embedding into policy dialogues. Maybe there I'd like to also highlight, and this is just a recent discussion that we've been having internally with our digital team, is applying or employing digital technologies, Earth observations, satellite data, to really try to start building cadastral records where we can see sex disaggregated or gender disaggregated data. And then empowerment, as you share, is very much framed around the co-benefits from productivity, dietary diversity, and child nutrition. And this very much underscores the need for ADB to better embed nutrition-sensitive and gender transformative approaches across agri-food investments. And maybe sometimes when we use such terminologies, it can be lost in translation. But definitely what we're trying to highlight to our teams and project officers is thinking about who are we doing this for? And that's the point I often reinforce, and your messages are really trying to demonstrate that too. Lastly, I also appreciate the emphasis you've placed on group-based and community-driven approaches, such as participatory village committees, where they can integrate nutrition, gender, and climate resilient agriculture and water resources management. And we're seeing the importance of that from a perspective of women's role in decision-making. I do believe, though, it's important for us from the development bank's perspective to go beyond that. What I often say is that 30% representation and come up with some really meaningful metrics, baselines, and targets, and ambitious targets. And so again, Lauren, thank you so much, because what you've shared with us and presented to us gives us that guideline and approach and ideas. And I'm sure through the next discussion, we'll have time to think more deeply on some of those areas where we can combine forces and deliver much more effectively on the ground. So thank you once again for sharing so much with us. And back to Tomoko.
Hey, thank you, Director Yasmin, for the valuable reflections. We are so lucky to have the Director Yasmin, who is very nutrition sensitive person who wants to, help us to have the good design with our gender and both gender and nutrition into it. And definitely, it's always good to put in our head that, who is this, the development support for. So thank you for these notes. Do we see any questions in our chat box, colleagues? Not yet. So is there anyone who would like to come in? Please raise your hand, or any information. Bimbika? Okay, Bimbika, would you like to come in?
Sure, Lauren. Thank you so much for the wonderful presentation. And it's so nicely that you've summarized the key findings from this report and also the call for action. But I was wondering if you could provide more sort of granular call for action for multilateral development banks like ADB on how we can sort of leverage this research to help close gender gaps in the Asia Pacific region. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. I think that the report doesn't really speak to what multilateral development banks can do, but I think a lot of the calls to action and policy recommendations are applicable to the ADB and to other multilateral development banks. So the first thing I would say is that there's an emphasis at looking at well-coordinated approaches which try to address the array of different challenges that women face when designing any kind of interventions in agriculture or agri-food systems. So the call is for an increased focus on gender responsive or gender transformative projects, rather than being just considering women as a target number of beneficiaries or being completely blind. Let's give some examples. An irrigation project could, for example, be a very useful agricultural intervention for improving productivity, but it could be designed in a way which is completely blind to the specific needs that women might face in accessing water resources or in having irrigation reach the tertiary level down to their farms. So a more sensitive approach, which could have much higher levels of impact, both in terms of economic benefits, but also social benefits, would move from that gender blind focus to thinking about which percentage of recipients could be women. That would be sort of thinking about women as beneficiaries, or could really try to get at the challenges women face for particular crops. That would be a gender responsive way to do an irrigation project. Or you could have a transformative approach where you could have even discussions at the village level with existing organizations about why women are not allowed to control or access water resources on their farms. That would be a sort of an approach which would not only seek to close the gap in terms of the access to water as a material problem, but also what is driving in that specific region culturally the fact that women are not in control of those water resources and may not be able to use it for their farms or their crops. So that's the kind of example that we try to give. Move from just not thinking about gender or thinking about it only as women as beneficiaries to really trying to think through the specific challenges that women face in accessing resources. So that's the first thing. The second thing is we're really calling on increasing the size of investments with gender approaches, which is easier for multilateral development banks to do sometimes than other types of actors like bilateral agencies or NGOs, because a lot of the positive approaches that we found in this report on the various things that I mentioned, social protection, group-based approaches, access to childcare, gender transformative approaches, were very small pilot projects. And while pilot projects are useful for demonstrating what works and how to do it, we need to try to adapt those approaches at larger scale and in sort of mainstream those approaches into much larger investment programs and projects like the ADB pursues. I also think that I know, because I've spoken with you before, that the work that you're doing on climate and heat extremes is really at the cutting edge of where the problem is, because it's such a strong and powerful impact on women in agri-food systems, especially in Southern Asia, but also elsewhere in the region. And so, approaches which consider the differentiated impacts on women and men from these climate extremes could be a really important finding for ADB. Over.
Excellent. Definitely all your knowledge and evidence can be scaled with our support. We would love to cooperate on that. I saw Matthias, who was coming in for question. Please, Matthias.
Thank you very much, Lauren, for that interesting presentation. My question is on very project specific, on the ground. When we engage with the government, there are many different, let's say, areas that we have to cover within an investment project, right? It has to be climate resilient. We have to focus on private sector. We have to do it, sort of like nutrition sensitive, food security, gender. There's so many areas that we have to cover within one project. Can it be done within one project? Are there some trade-offs? Kind of like just to understand a little bit also, the fiscal space is getting smaller, and we really have to show also the economic return on a project and when governments take out loans. So just very practical speaking, we're being pulled in so many different directions, just to kind of like also see sort of like how to engage with the government then in order to have all the areas under one project, if it's even possible.
Matthias, I think that's a really good and very practical question. And I used to work at IFAD, which also has a similar business model, even if much smaller than the ADB, of making loans to governments. And, convincing governments to borrow money to do work on social issues is often very, very challenging. And so the report was written both for people who are well-versed in the literature on gender and those that were not. And so some of those headline figures that I reported about the returns on investment for working with and including women in projects were designed specifically so that you could have good conversations with ministers of finance or ministers of agriculture to show the sort of positive benefits of investing in women. So the sort of GDP increase numbers, the reduction in food insecurity, those numbers were designed to help give sort of a broad, to help form a broad conversation with governments about the utility of this. Then the sort of the call that I mentioned on the last slide about the impacts of empowerment came from a set of data that we did with IFAD. So IFAD looked at its project portfolio and measured the impact on incomes, on food security, and on climate resilience to climate and other shocks for projects which empowered women and projects which did not empower women. And they found that the returns, for example, on resilience were 20% higher if you also included elements of the project which were empowering women. So there it was a quite obvious call. If you're looking to help insulate families from shocks related to climate, and you're not putting in approaches which help to shift norms and empower women, your return is 20% less. And so those kinds of statistics, which we can provide you with as well, I think could be very convincing to a government that's looking to achieve a multiplicity of different benefits in terms of nutrition, climate, productivity, and incomes.
Yeah, definitely this narrative when we, talk to the government and all the stakeholders is so crucial, and evidence and data. We definitely need that. So thank you so much for sharing. Ms. Shimran, I know you're coming from the Safeguard team, and thanks for sharing this important document. Would you like to come in and tell us more about it?
Well, thank you, Coco. It's not really, but it just, it's done 9 years ago, so it's quite a long time. But at that time, we heard they have a similar findings in other countries like Vietnam, Cambodia, that like take the example of forest sector, because a lot of this asset is registered by household, and the 95% household is had by men. So women from the beginning is in a disadvantage. and they don't have the ownership of the key asset in rural area. Actually, the same in maybe better situation in urban, and then that have a implication down the road because they don't have asset under their name. They cannot access easily to financial resources like as a mortgage or collateral to borrow for something. And the husband, we found that often behind them and then to mortgage their use the forest land, etc., as collateral. So there's and then that also affect their access to technical support, even though the government provided. But that is also affected through our study, affected by social norm. And for example, they are not. It's not a social norm for them to participate in the village meeting, and they generally have a lower education level. So even though the government provide technical service training to the village level, then the trainer often find the women have more difficulty to understand the training content because the lower education level. So it is, a lot of things are really beyond a single project, beyond, I don't know, it's really a systematic approach that, over years and then beyond project that can really change this. And but it has a lot of implication in real life. That's the main finding from that project. Yeah, but there's a lot of, so you can take a look of that. It is gender, try to be done gender segregatedly, and so it is. Yeah, thank you.
Any
Thank you so
feedback,
much.
Lauren? Mhm.
Yeah, no, I think that that's absolutely the reason, both in the forestry sector, but also with regards to other access to other types of resources and productive assets, why, women's registration and knowing who can not only have access to the resource, but also has decision-making power and authority over it is so important. So I just wanted to mention my colleague Clara is online, and she was putting in the chat that we are looking to publish in October with the Global Land Observatory a report on the status of land tenure in the world, which has a chapter on gender, which Clara and her team have been leading. And there are different types of ownership and asset ownership, like in forestry, communal ownership and customary control is very important. And so I think that there's additional insights which will come out there. So thank you for highlighting that finding. I also just wanted to mention, in response again to Matthias's question, that the World Bank has a gender innovation lab for each region of the world. I've just put the link in the chat, which has sort of evidence about experimental approaches which can increase the return on investment for World Bank projects. And I think that you might find some interesting cases in there that you could use in conversation with governments as well.
Thanks, Lauren. Just a follow-up question on that. Is there anything that the World Bank or IFAD is doing, and specifically in their project design, to look at these specific issues? I mean, we have kind of like obviously our standard, project processing, how we design the projects, obviously through the gender lens as well, but to get actual project activities that relate to the ones that you're saying, are other development partners doing something additionally, obviously with the resource constraints that we have with technical assistance, but are they kind of like some I don't know, low-hanging fruits that can be done to really have these kind of activities in the project design already early stages?
I know that IFAD has taken quite a substantial commitment to have at least, it used to be 25%, now I think it's increased to 35% of projects at design try to be transformative. So try to look at the underlying discriminatory social norms. And the way they are measuring that is using the Women's Empowerment in Agriculture Index at the project level, which I can put a link to in the chat. It came from IFPRI. And so what they're doing is they're designing interventions which are doing the normal things a project could do. So whatever the project's design is, but they're also including low cost sort of initiatives which try to look at the norms around production or around processing or whatever the project is talking about, to try to transform some of those outcomes that I mentioned that are linked to women's empowerment. And really, I mean, what the index looks at is whether or not women have more decision-making power, over production of income and use of revenue within their households, right? As well as the use of their own time. Time use is an important way to measure also women's empowerment, especially, Yasmin was mentioning in South Asia, for example, where women may have to travel very long distances, or where they may have care burdens, which are, let's say, dictated by the norms of, what the role of a daughter-in-law is, or the role of a younger woman in their household. And so having more autonomy to decide how you use your time each day is also a measure of empowerment. I'll put that in the chat as well.
Excellent. Thank you, Lauren. And thank you, Matthias, for good questions, which are very practical and useful for all of us. Anyone from the participants, any other questions? Okay, here. I'm going to lead out. Could you elaborate on what is meant by group-based approaches and why they are important for advancing gender equality and returns on investment for agricultural sector project? Over to you, Lauren.
Okay, thank you. So what we mean by group-based approach is working through an existing women's self-help group, community or village level organization, could be a savings and loan level kind of agreement, or it could be a sort of a cooperative, which includes women or is led by women. So when we're talking about these approaches, what we're thinking is that rather than taking, let's say, a value chain based approach, so say you were going to offer agricultural extension for people working in the rice value chain. There, you might just go to individual rice farmers and target them for training and agricultural extension. A group-based approach would instead try to find a cooperative, which includes a number of women, or which is a women-led cooperative, and provide agricultural extension to the group rather than seeking out individual farmers. And the reason that that works better for increasing the investment for extension or for other types of information is that there is, of course, power in numbers. Of women are more likely to adopt new practices and strategy when they're doing it along with their neighbors, with fellow farmers, with people that are in their social networks, but also because sometimes it's difficult for women to attend these kinds of trainings. And so having them in a way that is delivered at a time and a place when women are allowed to participate, where they're allowed to leave their homes to go to their meeting and participate, can facilitate the uptake of technologies. What we found is that women are equally or more likely to uptake new practices, climate smart agriculture, for example, but they often don't have access to the new information and technology, either because men are trained because they're head of household, or because they cannot attend the trainings when they're available. So that's just a sort of a practical example about how to better make sure that women are involved in the transformation, in the transmission of knowledge about agricultural practices.
Excellent. Definitely collective power is crucial. And I think opportunities for women to be really gaining all the information, knowledge, and skills would be important. Arlene Satampovanit, there's a question. A gender analysis will help, to shape the project design and gender transformative interventions. Is this usually practiced, and what framework do you use?
Yeah, I think different institutions have different frameworks. FAO's projects are always looked at by the gender team to assess whether or not they are, let's say we use the DAC marker, the OECD DAC marker, to see whether or not projects are blind to gender, that they score a 0, whether they include women in some way, but they're not the main focus of the project, those are scored as a 1, or whether or not they're focused on women, and that's scored as a 2. And we have a rubric which allows us to identify, even if they're in the category of 1, how they could be doing better to sort of better include women. So we have a rubric, in the gender team reviews projects, which are global in nature, and our regional gender focal points review those which are coming from individual countries or regions. FAO has taken, under the Commit to Grow Equality initiative, which we can put in the chat as well, we have taken on a commitment to have at least 10% of our projects include activities which are transformative at design. So back again to the question about transformative approaches. And the reason that we'd like to do that is that it's great that projects are solely focused on women. That's a score 2 on the DAC marker, but it doesn't really tell us whether or not the project is actually thinking about changing some of the structural issues that are affecting women's ability to participate in the project. And so we would like to be able to know at least that 10% of our projects are trying to get at those root causes of gender inequality and lack of women's empowerment. And so, we're experimenting and learning from other institutions which have been pioneering those approaches in a larger number of projects like EFAB, as I mentioned.
Excellent. I think we have one more question. Last question. Building on Matthias' question, you mentioned that the MDBs can scale scale pilots that have demonstrated proof of concept. Could you suggest how this can be done in practice? What are some ways these successful pilots can be integrated into larger projects or operations?
Thank you. I'm going to put an example from 2 projects that were done by IFAD, one in Burkina Faso and one in India, which were using transformative approaches to look at women's participation as well as the adaptation of climate-sensitive practices. So there, the entry point was really working with existing local level institutions, which had a good track record of working with women's self-help groups in India, in Maharashtra, that project, and I will share that. So I think the key to those projects is leveraging on existing local governance mechanisms or infrastructure, which is already very successful at incorporating women in their development practices, and using those as the entry point for larger lending programs. So rather than thinking about the lending program as just going to central government or to the Ministry of Agriculture and Capital, really finding a local implementation partner which already has a good track record of including women in important processes in those value chains can be a really effective way to sort of overcome the gap.
Thank you, Lauren, for the great examples. We will definitely look into them when we want to have this collaboration to scale up from the all the things you have been discovering with evidence. So thank you for all the participants with your good questions and engagement. So this session definitely has given us the solid evidence-based and operational entry points to reflect on how we, across ADB, government partners and stakeholders, can design more gender and nutrition-sensitive investment in the food system space. The case for integration of the gender empowerment to achieve better nutrition, climate resilience, and community well-being is clear. As we wrap up, I'm pleased to hand over to Director Sam Hung, who is leading the gender equality team, for the closing reflections. Director Sam, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Tomoko, and good afternoon, everyone from Manila. It's been a really excellent presentation, Lauren. Thanks very much on the status of women in agri-food systems. And I think it's very clear what the gender disparities are therein. Thank you also, Yasmin, for your thoughtful comments. You're always a great agenda champion, and we love to collaborate with you. And also to the audience for the engaging questions. It's already been a very valuable and thought-provoking discussion, so I'm not going to speak very long, but maybe I can just leave with sort of 3 observations or takeaways from the session. So first of all, I think it's very important to recognize that it's not just about giving women access to the resources, it's about ensuring they have control over them. And Lauren spoke about that a lot. So her presentation reminded us that if we're going to really promote gender equality in food systems, we need to tackle the access to resources that are tangible. I mean, we spoke about land, tools, infrastructure, and Lauren also mentioned finance and digital. But we also need to talk about the intangible aspects that are much more transformative in nature, such as women's control over decision-making, their roles at home and in the community, and tackling some of the social norms that actually limit what women can and cannot do. And those are the transformative approaches that we really need to shift towards so that we focus on changing attitudes, relationships, and systems as much and in tandem with addressing access to resources. So the second point, and I think this gets to Matthias's question and some of the responses that we heard, that we need to continually remind and recognize that addressing gender gaps makes food systems work better for everybody. The data and the evidence is clear. We know that gender barriers, whether it be food insecurity, working conditions, lack of access to resources, we know that gender equality is a barrier to progress, and that if we invest intentionally in women, we will see better outcomes, whether it be for families, farms, the economy, and returns on investments. And that's why organizations like ADB we are increasingly trying to focus on these kinds of actions. And that's something that the sector as a whole needs to do. We need to make the systems work for women. And lastly, I think we have the direction. The evidence is there to guide our next steps. The data is there. The examples, of course, we can always have more examples, but there are some examples on what works and some entry points. And we have heard very loud and clear that we need to do this at scale. Moving forward, we're especially interested in seeing how some of these insights can be applied at different levels. We heard some examples, but more examples from the region, sub-regional, country, and project level would be very useful. So we look forward to continuing this conversation with FAO and other partners to turn these insights into action. It's been a real pleasure working with our colleagues and AFNR on this important webinar series. It's a first, so we look forward to more to come. Thank you especially to the team on both sides, especially to Moko and for her excellent moderation, and Bimbika and others behind the scene. So thank you, and back to you, Toko.
Thank you, Director Sam. Very succinct and powerful, insightful remarks. Before we conclude, as Director Sam mentioned, this is the first, and we are going to continue this great series of the Gender Nexus Series webinar. Next session would be already decided by our team. It will be featuring Dr. Hazel Malapti from IFPRI, titled Women's Empowerment and Nutrition Outcomes Insights from Research and Practice. So we'll be deciding the date and we'll be informing. So stay tuned, and we would like to see you again. Thank you so much again, and have a great afternoon and morning. Bye.